Hello everyone, my name is Nick Rossler, and today I am presenting mSCOPE, a methodology for analyzing least privilege compartmentalization in large software artifacts. This is work with Lucas, Amani, Derek, Jay, Vasilios, Matthias, Adam, Andre, Jonathan, and Nathan. Okay, so today we rely heavily on overprivileged TCVs all the time, including every major operating system. If we think about Linux, for example, Linux is 30 million lines of code in size, and when it runs in a single monolithic environment where most accesses are unnecessary but allowed. To illustrate this, I've shown a heat map of the Linux kernel here that we created with our tool. In this figure, every row and column corresponds to a directory of source code, and the color of a cell indicates the number of interaction edges, such as read, writes, calls, and returns, that takes place between those two components. I'll talk more about the details of our system later, but the high-level takeaway here is that most of this figure is white, meaning most of the interactions are unnecessary and therefore could be removed. They represent overprivilege. This state of overprivilege is certainly bad for security because it means a bug anywhere could be a major problem for the security of the entire system. Most studies find bug rates to be rather high, on the order of 1 to 10 per 1,000 lines of code or so, and so that means we can't expect our monolithic systems to have bugs in them, and it's really bad if a bug anywhere can be used to compromise the security of the entire system. Okay, so if the problem is overprivilege, a natural question we can think about is it possible to retrofit privilege separation onto our monolithic systems? This is a complex question that has a couple sides to it. On the one side, there's a question of mechanism. So is it possible to impose intra-kernel separation within the kernel, even though all of the code is running at the highest privilege level? And recent work has shown that it is possible. So the nested kernel example is a system where it traps on all of the updates to virtual memory, and that does allow a intra-kernel system to impose a isolation primitive within the kernel. The other side of this question is a matter of policy. So assuming we do have a primitive for imposing isolation within the kernel, then what policy do we actually implement? So this policy question is the context that our work takes place in. So we've been looking at creating tools for automating privilege analysis and compartmentalization to address the issue of policy and help scale policies up to large systems. Okay, so some of the research questions that we address in this work specifically are, one, how much opportunity for privilege separation exists in our systems? So we hypothesize that due to modularity and good programming practices, there actually is a lot of separability within our systems if we can figure out how to exploit it. Two is, assuming we do want to separate our systems, where do we get the policies from? We hypothesize that a lot of the policy can be extracted from the dynamic behavior of the system, and that allows us to use automation techniques to reduce the burden on the human engineers and human developers that actually have to implement policies. So we're going to apply a automation type technique. Question number three is, how do we model privileges and policies? So we'll dig into our model in a couple slides. Question four is, how do we navigate trade-offs in privilege separation and overhead? So there's a whole lot of ways that you can think about decomposing a system into compartments. A lot of small compartments would give you good privilege separation, but would impose a high overhead. A couple big compartments would have less overhead, but would give you less privilege separation. And so how do we go about exploring this space of possibilities? So our solution is a framework and methodology that we call separability analysis. And it includes a couple components. One of them is a privilege model, the cat map, and we'll take a look at that in a minute. We also introduce a quantitative privilege metric called the privilege set, and this allows us to quantitatively compare and think about different compartmentalization hypotheses. And then lastly, we will look at algorithms for compartment generation and exploration. So once we have a quantitative way of thinking about privilege, we can use that as part of a cost function for optimization algorithms. And this allows us to much more efficiently explore the space and think about all of the possibilities. Okay, so the outline for the rest of the talk is I will start by introducing the privilege model, the cat map. After that, I will introduce the privilege metric, the privilege set. Then we'll look at automatic compartment generation once we have that foundation in place to pose compartment generation sort of as an optimization problem. We'll then look at creating privilege performance trade-off curves, and looking at the different ways that we can explore this space. Then we'll look at some of the kind of extensions that we can do with this framework in place, such as tuning different compartmentalization and some other extensions like that. And then lastly, we will look at some future work and conclusions. Okay, So if we think about the question of how to model privileges, well, we want a privilege model that is flexible enough to be used in real systems. We want it to be easy to analyze and work with. And we also want it to lend itself to security transformations so that a separation based on this model is something that we could actually implement. As a result of these horses, we came up with a privilege model that is basically a low-level instruction and object-level instantiation of Lamson's access matrix. In this model, a subject is an individual instruction, such as a specific load, call, or store instruction. A subject performs an action, which is a low-level assembly-level operation, such as a read, write, call, return, allocate, or free. And by allocate or free, we simply mean a call to an allocate routine or a free routine. And an action takes place on an object. Our object model is very simple, where any region of memory can be an object. So for example, each global variable is an object. In the case of dynamic objects, such as objects allocated on the heap, we group all objects by their allocation site. So all of the objects allocated from the same place are grouped together into one object class, which we simply call an object. What that means is, assuming there's no dynamically loaded or jitted code, that the number of objects would then be fixed at compile time, because they're identified by their allocation site in the code. Because this object model is very general, any region of memory can be an object. That means things like IO mapped regions or devices or per CPU variables or anything else can also be considered an object. And that means any abstraction can be sort of represented in this model. In the case of a call or return, then the object itself is also code, and that means a instruction can be both a subject and an object. And then lastly, subjects and objects can include any additional context, such as the PID, part of the call chain, the entry point into the kernel, or anything else. And that allows the model to encode context-sensitive privileges. Okay, so on the last slide, we saw what an individual privilege was. A cat map, a context-aware privilege memory access pattern, is a collection of privileges. So it's the set of privileges that a program requires to run. And it can be thought of as a privilege graph or an access control matrix. So for example, if every node is an instruction or object and the edges encode the allowed privileges, or in the matrix case, that the rows and columns would be the subjects and objects, and the matrix would specify what operations are allowed. A big advantage of this model is that cat maps can actually be mined on real systems. So we can really run a program and produce its cat map from an actual real system. And indeed, in previous work, we built Memorizer. Memorizer is a tracing Linux kernel that produces cat maps. I'll refer you to the Memorizer paper for complete details. But basically what we did there is we added hooks into all of the kernel's allocators, and then we use shadow objects to track all of the objects that are allocated by the kernel. And then we hook the Casan load and store instrumentation to track access objects. And then we also instrument calls and returns to collect the control flow data so that we can collect all this cat map data from an actual system. To make this concrete, I'm going to show one actual output from our tool just to show you what this really looks like. So this is an example of the output from Memorizer. The first line here that is not indented indicates a new object. Some of the fields here are the alloc IP, so the location where this object was allocated from, the process ID that performed the allocation, the virtual address of the object size, the allocation time and the free time, the freeing instruction, the allocator type, so this is a KMM cache object, the process, and then if it's a slab object, then the name of the slab. So this is from the files cache. It's a file descriptor object. And then each row below this first line indicates an access to that object. So the first field is the virtual address of the instruction. And then the next two fields are the number of loads and stores that were performed on this object. And so basically we can really collect this data from a system. And then basically the rest of this paper is about doing analysis on this data to think about the separability of the system and to explore the range of possible separations that we can make on this system. Okay, so the cat map contains instruction level privileges, and it's essentially the definition of the least privilege in our model. However, enforcing these low-level fine-grained privileges is likely not going to be practical for an actual enforcement. So if we think about an actual runtime monitor, we probably can't enforce these fine-grained instruction level policies. And so instead what we're going to do is we're going to group things into larger compartments. We define a subject domain as a collection of instructions. Every instruction goes into exactly one subject domain. We define an object domain as a collection of objects. Every object goes into exactly one object domain. And then between each subject domain and object domain, and for each operation, we define a mediation type. There are three possible mediation types. One is none, meaning no access is permitted between the subject and the object domains for that operation. Another is mediated, which means the runtime monitor would validate the access against the fine-grained cat map. And then lastly, there's unmediated, which represents a relaxation of privilege, and it means any operation of that type of the subject may act upon the object. And so these are the three mediation types. And then lastly, we define a compartmentalization as a division of each instruction into a subject domain, each object into an object domain, and an assignment of an edge type of none, mediated, or unmediated for each of those triples. Okay, so with the setup of having the privilege model and the cat map and the compartmentalization model, we're now going to start thinking quantitatively about privilege. I'm going to start with a couple definitions. The first is the privilege set. The privilege set is the complete set of fine-grained privileges that are permitted for a given program under a particular compartmentalization. Note that that may include many more privileges than exist in the cat map. Then to get quantitative about PS, we're going to think about taking the size of the PS, or take a sum over the edges that are in the PS. The complete formalization for this is in the paper, but at a high level and put simply, we assign 1 unit of privilege to one instruction being able to access 1 byte of data. In the case of dynamic objects, like on the heap, we'll take their size to be the average number of bytes that are live at a time on average for that particular allocation site. An advantage of an approach like this is it's completely automatic. We don't need a human being to label all of the objects in the system. It's something we can compute automatically, although of course this is a simplistic view of privilege. Although to tune it, we can do things like set different weights on objects or different weights on different operation types or other types of tuning like that. And I'm going to talk about some of that in a couple slides from now. There are a couple PSs that are important that we can think about. One of them is PS-min, which is the PS of the cat map. Recall that the cat map is the definition of least privilege in our model. And so PS-min is the minimum amount of privilege that the program needs to function. On the other side of the spectrum, there's PS-mono, which is the PS of the fully unseparated system, so the complete amount of privilege that would exist in a fully unseparated system. So that's the upper bound on privilege. And then in order to enable us to compare privileges between compartmentalizations, we're going to define the PSR, which is the privilege set ratio, which we get by taking the PS for a particular compartmentalization divided by PS-mono. So for example, PSR-min, the lower bound of PSR, is PS-min divided by PS-mono. And then the PSR for any particular compartmentalization is the PS for that compartmentalization divided by PS-mono. And what that means is for any compartmentalization, its PSR is a value between PSR-min, the least privilege theoretical lower bound, and 1, which is the upper bound of the monolithic case. So it's a number between PSR-min and 1. And once we have a quantitative way of thinking about privilege, that enables us to pose compartment generation as an optimization problem. So in particular, PSR serves as our proxy for security. It's telling us how much privilege reduction we have. But of course, we also care about overhead. And so for this, we have a set of cost models that we apply to the weighted traces. And that allows us to estimate how much, what the overhead might be like for some particular separation. And you'll see that in my example in a second. But basically, by setting up in a quantitative way like this, we're now ready to approach this from an algorithmic perspective, where we want to minimize PSR, and while keeping the overhead as low as possible. Okay, so I'm now going to talk about our compartmentalization algorithm, which is basically a graph clustering algorithm, a greedy graph clustering algorithm. So, and I'm going to show an example and walk through the example as I explain the algorithm. So to initialize, we put each function and each object into a new domain. So the subject domains here are shown as the blue circles, and the object domains are shown as the green circles. And there are 3 functions, f1, f2, and f3, and they have each been placed in their own subject domains. And there are 3 objects, o1, o2, and o3, and they've each been placed in their own object domains. And then note that I've shown the weighted edges from the tracing data, where the dashed lines represent reads that are from the subject domains to the objects, and the solid lines between the subjects represent call or return edges, which I'm not differentiating just to keep this figure simpler. Okay, so the flow of the algorithm is that we proceed in steps, and at every step, we pick one pair of subject domains to merge together, or one pair of object domains to merge together. To do so, we consider all possible pairs of subject domains and object domains. And for each of those pairs, we compute a sort of utility ratio, which is the performance savings that we expect to get by merging them together, divided by the increase in privilege that would occur. So we're looking at reducing overhead, reducing the most overhead we can per increase in privilege. So for example, between F1 and F2, there are 200 calls and returns, which means if we placed a boundary there, then we would expect to incur 200 times the cost of a domain transfer. And so if we combined F1 and F2 together, then that would save us 200 times the cost of that domain transfer. But we don't only care about performance, we also care about the privilege impact that we're making while we're creating this compartmentalization. Note that F1 and F2 have pretty similar access patterns to objects. F1 performs reads to O1, and F2 performs reads to O1 and O2. So they're similar, but note that F1 currently does not have an edge to O2, and so if we were to merge them together, then there would be an increase in PS, and it would come from the F1 to O2 edge. I haven't shown the object sizes or operation counts here, so we're not going to calculate it exactly, but there's a more detailed example in the paper if you'd like to work through an example. So then we would then take the pair with the highest ratio, and we would perform that merge. So for example, I've now shown merging together F1 and F2, which we'll say was the best merge of all possible pairs. And then that would look like this. And then that's basically the flow of the algorithm, is we continue performing merges to create coarser and coarser subjects and objects. And then the end of this is that we exit when no merges remain above a minimum threshold alpha. And so alpha you can think of as sort of the amount of performance savings that you expect to get per unit of PS, so it's a minimum threshold. And the important thing about alpha is that it gives us a knob that we can tune to control the behavior of the algorithm. So a large value of alpha means that the algorithm stops earlier and only performs the very best merges, and so it gives you a large number of small compartments, where a very low value of alpha causes the algorithm to run for many more steps, and that creates a smaller number of large compartments. And so by tuning alpha, you can change the kind of compartments that you get from the algorithm. Okay, so that was a little bit abstract. To make this concrete, I'm now showing you one of the compartments that was actually created by this algorithm on the real kernel data. A couple observations. So one is that the compartments that are produced by this algorithm sort of make sense to a human inspecting them, and that they usually combine together functions that have high call connectivity with each other and that access similar data. In this example, we can see some functions from the block subsystem being combined with the SCSI drivers. And given how we've defined privilege and given how we've set up these algorithms, that sort of makes sense. And so I would say a high-level takeaway is that if we are able to describe what we want the compartments to look like, then we sort of can generate them algorithmically in a setup like this. One thing to note is that the compartments typically combine functions from the same files and folders together, although not always, and I'll talk about why that's important on the next slide. Okay, next we're going to look at some privilege performance trade-off curves. In this plot, every point corresponds to one possible compartmentalization. The x-axis shows PSR. Recall that lower is better, and the black vertical line corresponds to PSR min, which is the theoretical lower bound on privilege. And the y-axis shows overhead, which in this case is for the VM-func cost model. Each of the colored lines here corresponds to running the clustering algorithms with a different value of alpha, and all of the points in that line show the various possibilities of the mediation settings for that compartmentalization. The red line corresponds to a large value of alpha, which produces a large number of small compartments, and as we can see, those have a high overhead and a low PSR. The purple lines on the right, for example, then correspond to a small value of alpha, which produces a small number of larger compartments, and as we can see, those have a lower overhead, but result in a higher PSR. So this allows us to see the range of outcomes and how the settings to the algorithms impact the results. Some of the big takeaways. One is that by adopting algorithms like this, we can automate exposing the full range of privileged performance points. So rather than just creating one compartmentalization, we're exploring many possibilities at once. In terms of results, these are encouraging so far. So for example, we show that we can reduce 99.8% of privileges at an estimated 15% overhead. So that's just calling out one of the many points that are on this plot. And then one more thing I want to call out here is that we've found that the algorithmic domains are much better than the syntactic domains. And by syntactic domains, we mean security domains that are created based on the source code structure rather than from the algorithms, such as taking every file or folder to be a compartment. And we find that the algorithms can do much better than the syntactic domains because they have the freedom to move around functions, and the syntactic domains tend to cut some high degree edges, which causes a lot of overhead. So the source code structure we find is not a good indication of compartment boundaries. Okay, so beyond these aggregate results, a big advantage of automation is it allows us to easily tune the compartmentalizations and interactively look at what we're getting. And this allows us to also to respond to evolving code bases and threat models. So for example, if there's one object that has a high security importance, then we can reweight that object and rerun the algorithms to produce new compartmentalizations that better protect that object. In this example, we're analyzing the struct cred object, which stores process credentials in the Linux kernel, and it's a common target for kernel exploits. In this plot, each point also corresponds to one particular compartmentalization. In this case, the y-axis shows the write over privilege for just the one struct cred object, which is how many more instructions can write to that object than is strictly necessary. And the x-axis shows the overhead of the whole system for the Pareto-optimal best compartmentalization that is found for that overhead level across all the alpha values. The red line corresponds to the default flow of the algorithm, where all objects have a weight of 1. In this case, at a 10% overhead, for example, there are about 8x more write instructions that can write to creds and are strictly necessary. However, if we apply a weight of 100 to the cred and then rerun the algorithms, that drops down to more like 2x. And then if we run the algorithms with an infinite weight on cred, which is sort of telling the algorithms to protect that object at all costs, then we can get that number down to about 1, which is where no additional write instructions have access that are necessary. And so what this shows is how easy it is to interact with the tools and tune the compartments that we get. Okay, so that's about the end of the talk in terms of big takeaways. One is that by adopting a quantitative view of privilege, we can pose compartment generation as an optimization problem and automatically generate compartments. Still unknown though is how good are they? So we certainly need to do security evaluation on them. And furthermore, we intentionally built a framework that is highly parameterizable, so we can set different weights on objects and operation types, and finding the right weights and tuning the algorithms to match our threat models. These are all open questions. The limit study of privilege separability that we do here is encouraging. So for example, we show that 99.8% of privileges can be reduced at an estimated 15% overhead. But these are overhead estimates, and there's certainly a lot of engineering work left to do to realize these on a real system. All of the datasets and algorithms are open source. That includes Memorizer, which is our tracing kernel that can produce cat maps, so you can find that online. And also all of the algorithms and datasets in mSCOPE are online as well. We collected about 8 CPU months worth of kernel data, and so if you're interested in kernel data, there's a lot that can be downloaded there. And we also have a tutorial that walks you through running the compartment generation algorithms. And additionally, we've put up a couple explorers. So one of them is an object explorer that shows all of the access patterns to kernel objects that we collected in our traces. And we also put up a compartment explorer that shows the output of the compartmentalization algorithms. So you can check those out. And then lastly, if you're interested in connecting, Nathan Downhod is the lead PI on this work, and he's currently working on some of these follow-on extensions. And so feel free to drop him a line. And that's it. Thank you so much for watching.